Welcome back to Nightfall Sleep Radio. Tonight, we continue our journey through E.M. Berens' 1880 book, The Myths and Legends of Ancient Greece and Rome. If you'd like to hear the full series, there's a link to the playlist in the video description. Please subscribe if you'd like notifications when new episodes are released. Let's get started with the next chapter of the book. We'll be finishing out the Olympian gods, from Helios to Poseidon, and along the way we'll explore Apollo, the many faces of Artemis, and several other deities of Mount Olympus. Helios. The worship of Helios was introduced into Greece from Asia. According to the earliest conceptions of the Greeks, he was not only the sun god, but also the personification of life and all life-giving power. For light is well known to be an indispensable condition of all healthy terrestrial life. The worship of the sun was originally very widely spread, not only among the Greeks themselves, but also among other primitive nations. To us, the sun is simply the orb of light, which, however above our heads, performs each day the functions assigned to it by a mighty and invisible power. We can therefore form but a faint idea of the impression it would have produced upon the spirit of a people whose intellect was still in its infancy, and who believed with childlike simplicity that every power of nature was a divinity, which according to its character was baleful or beneficent, worked for the destruction or the benefit of the human race. Helios, who was the son of the Titans Hyperion and Thea, is described as rising every morning in the east, preceded by his sister Eos, the dawn, who with her rosy fingers paints the tips of the mountains and draws aside that misty veil through which her brother is about to appear. When he has burst forth in all the glorious light of day, Eos disappears, and Helios now drives his flame-darting chariot along the accustomed track. This chariot, which is of burnished gold, is drawn by 4 fire-breathing steeds, behind which the young god stands erect with flashing eyes, his head surrounded with rays, holding in one hand the reins of those fiery concourses, which in all hands save his are unmanageable. When towards the evening he descends the curve in order to cool his burning forehead in the waters of the deep sea, he is followed closely by his sister Selene, the moon, who is now prepared to take charge of the world and illumine with her silver crescent the dusky night. Helios, meanwhile, rests from his labors, and reclining softly on the cool, fragrant couch prepared for him by the sea nymphs, recruits himself for another life-giving, joy-inspiring, and beauteous day. It may appear strange that, although the Greeks considered the earth to be a flat circle, no explanation is given of the fact that Helios sinks down in the far west regularly every evening, and yet reappears as regularly every morning in the east. Whether he was supposed to pass through Tartarus and thus regain the opposite extremity through the bowels of the earth, or whether he thought he possessed any other means of making this transit, there is not a line in either Homer or Hesiod to prove. In later times, however, the poets invented the graceful fiction that when Helios had finished his course and reached the western side of the curve, a winged boat or a cup, which had been made for him by Hephæstus, awaited him there, and conveyed him rapidly with his glorious equipage to the east, where he recommenced his bright and glowing career. This divinity was invoked as a witness when a solemn oath was taken, as it was believed that nothing escaped his all-seeing eye. And it was this fact which enabled him to inform Demeter of the fate of her daughter, as already related. He was supposed to possess flocks and herds in various localities, which he may possibly be intended to represent the days and nights of the year, or the stars of heaven. Helios is said to have loved Clytie, a daughter of Oceanus, who ardently returned his affection. But in the course of time, the fickle sun god transferred his devotion to Leucothea, the daughter of Orcamus, king of the eastern countries, which so angered the forsaken Clytie that she informed Orcamus of his daughter's attachment, and he punished her by inhumanely burying her alive. Helios, overcome with grief, endeavored by every means in his power to recall her to life. At last, finding all his efforts unavailing, he sprinkled her grave with heavenly nectar, and immediately there sprang forth from the spot a shoot of frankincense, which spread around its aromatic perfume. The jealous Clytie gained nothing by her cruel conduct, and the sun god came to her no more. Inconsolable at his loss, she threw herself on the ground and refused all sustenance. For 9 long days she turned her face toward the glorious god of day as he moved along the heavens, till at length her limbs became rooted in the ground, and she was transformed into a flower which ever turns toward the sun. Helios married Perse, daughter of Oceanus, and their children were Aeetes, king of Colchis, celebrated in the legend of the Argonauts as the possessor of the golden fleece, and Circe, the renowned sorceress. Helios had another son named Phaethon, whose mother was Clymene, one of the Oceanides. The youth was very beautiful, and a favorite with Aphrodite, who entrusted him with the care of one of her temples, which flattering proof of her regard caused him to become vain and presumptuous. His friend Epaphus, son of Zeus and Io, endeavored to check his youthful vanity by pretending to disbelieve his assertion that the sun god was his father. Phaethon, full of resentment and eager to be able to refute his calumny, hastened to his mother Clymene and besought her to tell him whether Helios was really his father. Moved by his entreaties, and at the same time angry with the approach of Epaphus, Clymene pointed to the glorious sun then shining down upon them, and assured her son that in that bright orb held the author of his being, adding that if he still had any doubt, he might visit the radiant dwelling of the great god of light and inquire for himself. Overjoyed at his mother's reassuring words, and following the directions she gave him, Phaethon quickly wended his way to his father's palace. As he entered the palace of the sun god, the dazzling rays almost blinded him and prevented him from approaching the throne on which his father was seated, surrounded by the hours, days, months, years, and seasons. Helios, who with his all-seeing eye had watched him from afar, removed his crown of glittering rays and bade him not to be afraid, but to draw near to his father. Encouraged by this kind reception, Phaethon entreated him to bestow upon him such proof of his love that all the world might be convinced that he was indeed his son. Whereupon Helios desired him to ask any favor he pleased, and swore by the Styx that it should be granted. The impetuous youth immediately requested permission to drive the chariot of the sun for 1 whole day. His father listened, horror-struck, to this presumptuous demand, and by representing the many dangers which would beset his path, endeavored to dissuade him from so perilous an undertaking. But his son, deaf to all advice, pressed his point with such pertinacity that Helios was reluctantly compelled to lead him to the chariot. Phaethon paused for a moment to admire the beauty of the glittering equipage, the gift of the god of fire, who had formed it of gold and ornamented it with precious stones, which reflected the rays of the sun. And now Helios, seeing his sister the Dawn opening her doors at the rosy east, ordered the Hours to yoke the horses. The goddesses speedily obeyed the command, and the father then announced the face of his own son with a sacred balm to enable him to endure the burning flames which issued from the nostrils of the steeds, and sorrowfully placed his crown of rays upon his head, desiring him to ascend the chariot. The eager youth joyfully took his place and grasped the coveted reins, but no sooner did the fiery coursers of the sun feel the inexperienced hand which attempted to guide them than they became restive and unmanageable. Wildly they rushed out of their accustomed track, now soaring so high as to threaten the heavens with destruction, and descending so low as to nearly set the earth on fire. At last, the unfortunate charioteer, blinded with glare and terrified at the awful devastation he had caused, dropped the reins from his trembling hands. Mountains and forests were in flames, rivers and streams were dried up, and a general conflagration was imminent. The scorched earth now called on Zeus for help, who hurled his thunderbolt at Phaethon, and with a flash of lightning brought the fiery steeds to a standstill. The lifeless body of the youth fell headlong into the river Artemis, where it was received and buried by the nymphs of the stream. His sisters mourned for so long that they were transformed by Zeus into poplars, and the tears they shed, falling into the waters, became drops of clear, transparent amber. Cycnus, the faithful friend of the unhappy Phaethon, felt such overwhelming grief at his terrible fate that he pined and wasted away. The gods, moved with compassion, transformed him into a swan, which forever brooded over the fatal spot where the waters had closed over the head of his unfortunate friend. The chief seat of the worship of Helios was the island of Rhodes, which, according to the following myth, was his special territory. At the time of the Titamachia, when the gods were dividing the world by lot, Helios happened to be absent, and consequently received no share. He therefore complained to Zeus, who proposed to have a new allotment. But this Helios would not allow, saying that as he pursued his daily journey, his penetrating eye had beheld a lovely fertile island lying beneath the waves of the ocean. And if the immortals would swear to give him the undisturbed possession of this spot, he would be content to accept it as his share of the universe. The gods took the oath, whereupon the island of Rhodes immediately raised itself above the surface of the waters. The famous Colossus of Rhodes, which was one of the 7 wonders of the world, was erected in honor of Helios. This wonderful statue was 105 feet high and was formed entirely of brass. It formed the entrance to the harbor at Rhodes, and the largest vessel could easily sail between the legs, which stood on moles each side of the harbor. Though so gigantic, it was perfectly proportioned in every part. Some idea of its size may be gained from the fact that very few people were able to span the thumb of the statue with their arms. In the interior of the Colossus was a winding staircase leading to the top, from the summit of which, by means of a telescope, the coast of Syria and also the shores of Egypt are said to have been visible. Eos. Eos, the dawn, like her brother Helios, whose advent she always announced, was also deified by the early Greeks. She too had her own chariot, which she drove across the vast horizon, both morning and night, before and after the sun god. Hence, she is not merely the personification of the rosy morn, but also of twilight, for which reason her palace is placed in the west, on the island of Aea. The abode of Eos is a magnificent structure, surrounded by flowery meads and velvety lawns, where nymphs and other immortal beings wind in and out of the mazy figures of the dance, whilst the music of a sweetly tuned melody accompanies their graceful gliding movements. Eos is described by the poets as a beautiful maiden with rosy arms and fingers and large wings, whose plumage is an ever-changing hue. She bears a star on her forehead and a torch in her hand. Wrapping round her the rich folds of her violet-tinged mantle, she leaves her couch before the break of day, and herself yokes her 2 horses, Lampteus and Phaethon, to her glorious chariot. She then hastens with active cheerfulness to open the gates of heaven, in order to herald the approach of her brother, the god of day, while the tender plants and flowers, revived by morning dew, lift their heads to welcome her as she passes. Eos first married the Titan Astrius, and their children were Hephæstus, the evening star, and the winds. She afterwards became united to Tithonus, son of Laomedon, king of Troy, who had won her affection by his unrivaled beauty. And Eos, unhappy at the thought of their ever being separated by death, obtained for him from Zeus the gift of immortality, forgetting, however, to add to it that of eternal youth. The consequence was that when, in the course of time, Tithonus grew old and decrepit and lost all the beauty which had won her admiration, Eos became disgusted with his infirmities, and at last shut him up in a chamber, where soon little else was left of him but his voice, which had now sunk into a weak, feeble quaver. According to some of the later poets, he became so weary of his cheerless and miserable existence that he entreated to be allowed to die. This was, however, impossible. But Eos, pitying his unhappy condition, exerted her divine power and changed him into a grasshopper, which is, as it were, all voice, and whose monotonous, ceaseless chirpings may not inaptly be compared to the meaningless babble of extreme old age. Phœbus-Apollo. Phœbus-Apollo, the god of light, prophecy, music, poetry, and the arts and sciences, is by far the noblest conception within the whole range of Greek mythology. And his worship, which not only extended to all the states of Greece, but also to Asia Minor and to every Greek colony throughout the world, stands out among the most ancient and strongly marked features of Grecian history, and exerted a more decided influence over the Greek nation than that of any other deity, not excepting Zeus himself. Apollo was the son of Zeus and Leto, and was born beneath the shade of a palm tree, which grew at the foot of Mount Scythias, on the barren and rocky island of Delos. The poets tell us that the earth smiled when the young god first beheld the light of day, and that Delos became so proud and exultant at the honor thus conferred upon her that she covered herself with golden flowers, swans surrounded the island, and the Delian nymphs celebrated his birth with songs of joy. The unhappy Leto, driven to Delos by the relentless persecutions of Hera, was not permitted to enjoy her haven of refuge. Being still tormented by her enemy, the young mother was once more obliged to fly. She therefore resigned the charge of her newborn babe to the goddess Themis, who carefully wrapped the helpless infant in swaddling clothes and fed him with nectar and ambrosia. But he had no sooner partaken of the heavenly food than, to the amazement of the goddess, he burst asunder the bands which confined his infant limbs, and sprang to his feet, and appeared to her as a full-grown youth of divine strength and beauty. He now demanded a lyre and a bow, declaring that henceforth he should announce to mankind the will of his father Zeus. "The golden lyre," said he, "shall be my friend, the bent bow my delight, and in oracles I will foretell the dark future." With these words he ascended to Olympus, where he was received with joyful acclamations into the assembly of the celestial gods, who acknowledged him as the most beautiful and glorious of all the sons of Zeus. Phœbus-Apollo was the god of light in a twofold signification. First, as representing the great orb of day which illuminates the world, and secondly, as the heavenly light which animates the soul of man. He inherited his function as the sun god from Helios, with whom in later times he was so completely identified that the personality of one gradually became merged in that of the other. We accordingly find Helios frequently confounded with Apollo, myths belonging to the former attributed to the latter, and some tribes, the Ionic for instance, so complete is this identification that Apollo is called by them Helios-Apollo. As the divinity whose power is developed in the broad light of day, he brings joy and delight to nature, and health and prosperity to man. By the influence of his warm and gentle rays, he disperses the noxious vapors of the night, assists the grain to ripen, and the flowers to bloom. But although, as god of the sun, he is a life-giving and life-preserving power, who by his genial influence dispels the cold winter, he is at the same time the god who by means of his fiercely darting rays could spread disease and send sudden death to men and animals. And it is to this phase of his character that we should look for the explanation of his being considered in conjunction with his twin sister Artemis, the moon goddess, a divinity of death. The brother and sister share this function between them, he taking man and she, woman, as her aim, and those especially who died in the bloom of youth or at an advanced age were believed to have been killed by their gentle arrows. But Apollo did not always send an easy death. We see in the Iliad how, when angry with the Greeks, the god of the silver bow strode down from Olympus with his quiver full of death-bringing darts and sent a raging pestilence into their camp. For 9 days he let fly his fatal arrows, first on animals and then on men, until the air became darkened with the smoke from funeral pyres. In this character of god of light, Phœbus-Apollo is the protecting deity of shepherds, because it is he who warms the fields and meadows and gives rich pastures to the flocks, thereby gladdening the heart of the herdsman. As the temperate heat of the sun exercises so invigorating an effect on man and animals, and promotes the growth of those medicinal herbs and vegetable productions necessary for the cure of diseases. Phœbus-Apollo was supposed to possess the power of restoring life and health. Hence, he was regarded as the god of healing. But this feature in his character we shall find more particularly developed in his son Asclepius, the veritable god of the healing art. Pursuing our analysis of the various phases of the character of Phœbus-Apollo, we find that with the first beams of his genial light, all nature awakens to renewed life, and the woods re-echo with the jubilant sound of the untaught lays, warbled by thousands of feathered choristers. Hence, by a natural inference, he is the god of music, and as, according to the belief of the ancients, the inspirations of genius were inseparably connected with the glorious light of heaven, he is also the god of poetry and acts as special patron to the arts and sciences. Apollo is himself the heavenly musician among the Olympic gods, whose banquets are gladdened by the wondrous strains which he produces from his favorite instrument, the seven-stringed lyre. In the cultus of Apollo, music formed a distinguishing feature. All sacred dances and even the sacrifices in his honor were performed to the sound of musical instruments. And it is, in a great measure, owing to the influence which the music in his worship exercised on the Greek nation, that Apollo came to be regarded as the leader of the 9 muses, the legitimate divinities of poetry and song. In this character, he is called Muscagetes, and is always represented robed in a long flowing garment. His lyre, to the tones of which he appears to be singing, is suspended by a band across his chest. His head is encircled by a wreath of laurel, and his long hair, streaming down over his shoulders, gives him a somewhat effeminate appearance. And now we must view the glorious god of light under another, and as far as regards his influence over the Greek nation, much more important aspect. For in historical times, all the other functions and attributes of Apollo sink into comparative insignificance before the great power which he exercised as god of prophecy. It is true that all Greek gods were endowed, to a certain extent, with the faculty of foretelling future events. But Apollo, as sun god, was the concentration of all prophetic power, as it was supposed that nothing escaped his all-seeing eye, which penetrated the most hidden recesses and laid bare the secrets which lay concealed beneath the dark veil of the future. We have seen that when Apollo assumed his godlike form, he took his place among the immortals. But he had not long enjoyed the rapturous delights of Olympus before he felt within him an ardent desire to fulfill his great mission of interpreting to mankind the will of his mighty Father. He accordingly descended to earth and traveled through many countries, seeking a fitting site upon which to establish an oracle. At length, he reached the southern side of the rocky heights of Parnassus, beneath which lay the harbor of Crissa. Here, under the overhanging cliff, he found a secluded spot where from the most ancient times there had existed an oracle, in which Gaia herself had revealed the future to man, and which, in Deucalion's time, she had resigned to Themis. It was guarded by the huge serpent Python, the scourge of the surrounding neighborhood, and the terror alike of man and cattle. The young god, full of confidence in his unerring aim, attacked and slew the monster with his arrows, thus freeing land and people from their mighty enemy. The grateful inhabitants, anxious to do honor to their deliverer, flocked around Apollo, who proceeded to mark out a plan for a temple. And with the assistance of numbers of eager volunteers, a suitable edifice was soon erected. It now became necessary to choose ministers who would offer up sacrifices, interpret his prophecies to the people, and take charge of the temple. Looking around, he saw in the far distance a vessel bound from Crete to the Peloponnesus, and determined to avail himself of her crew for his service. Assuming the shape of an enormous dolphin, he agitated the waters to such a degree that the ship was tossed violently to and fro, to the great alarm of the mariners. At the same time, he raised a mighty wind, which drove the ship into the harbor of Crissa, where she ran aground. The terrified sailors dared not set foot on shore. But Apollo, under the form of a vigorous youth, stepped down to the vessel and revealed himself in his true character, and informed them that it was he who had driven them to Crissa, in order that they might become his priests and serve him in his temple. Arrived at the sacred fane, he instructed them how to perform the services in his honor, and desired them to worship him under the name of Apollo Delphinios, because he had first appeared to them under the form of a dolphin. Thus was established the far-famed oracle of Delphi, the only institution of the kind which was not exclusively national, for it was consulted by Lydians, Phrygians, Etruscans, Romans, and in fact it was held in the highest repute all over the world. In obedience to its decrees, the laws of Lycurgus were introduced, and the earliest Greek colonies founded. No cities were built without first consulting the Delphic oracle, for it was believed that Apollo took special delight in the founding of cities, the first stone of which he laid in person. Nor was any enterprise ever undertaken without inquiring at this sacred fane as to its probable success. But that which brought Apollo more closely home to the hearts of the people, and raised the whole moral tone of the Greek nation, was the belief, gradually developed with the intelligence of the people, that he was the God who accepted repentance as an atonement for sin, who pardoned the contrite sinner, and who acted as a special protector of those who, like Orestes, had committed a crime which required long years of expiation. Apollo is represented by the poets as being eternally young. His countenance, glowing with joyous life, is the embodiment of immortal beauty. His eyes are a deep blue, his forehead low but broad and intellectual. His hair, which falls over his shoulders in long waving locks, is of a golden or warm chestnut hue. He is crowned with laurel and wears a purple robe. In his hand he bears a silver bow, which is unbent when he smiles, but ready for use when he menaces evildoers. Apollo, the eternally beautiful youth, the perfection of all that is graceful and refined, rarely seems to have been happy in his love. Either his advances met with a repulse, or his union with the object of his affection was attended with fatal consequences. His first love was Daphne, daughter of Peneus, the river god, who was so averse to marriage that she entreated her father to allow her to lead a life of celibacy, to devote herself to the chase, which she loved to the exclusion of all other pursuits. But one day, soon after his victory over the Python, Apollo happened to see Eros bending his bow, and proud of his own superior strength and skill, he laughed at the efforts of the little archer, saying that such a weapon was more suited to the one who had just killed the terrible serpent. Eros angrily replied that his arrow should pierce the heart of the mocker himself, and flying off to the summit of Mount Parnassus, he drew from his quiver 2 darts of different workmanship, one of gold, which had the effect of inspiring love, and the other of lead, which created aversion. Taking aim at Apollo, he pierced his breast with the golden shaft, whilst the leaden one he discharged into the bosom of the beautiful Daphne. The son of Leto instantly fell in the most ardent affection for the nymph, who on her part evinced the greatest dislike towards her divine lover. And at his approach, she fled from him like a hunted deer. He called upon her in the most endearing accents to stay, but she still sped on, until at length, becoming faint with fatigue, and fearing that she was about to succumb, she called upon the gods to come to her aid. Hardly had she uttered her prayer before a heavy torpor seized her limbs, and just as Apollo threw out his arms to embrace her, she became transformed into a laurel bush. He sorrowfully crowned his head with its leaves, and declared, in memory of his love, that it should henceforth remain evergreen and be held sacred to him. He next sought the love of Marpessa, the daughter of Evenus. Even though her father approved his suit, the maiden preferred a youth named Idas, who contrived to carry her off in a winged chariot which he had procured from Poseidon. Apollo pursued the fugitives, whom he quickly overtook, and forcibly seizing the bride, refused to resign her. Zeus then interfered, and declared that Marpessa herself must decide which of her lovers should claim her as his wife. After due reflection, she accepted Idas as her husband, judiciously concluding that although the attractions of the divine Apollo were superior to those of her lover, it would be wiser to unite herself to a mortal, who, growing old with herself, would be less likely to forsake her when advancing years should rob her of her charms. Cassandra, the daughter of Priam, king of Troy, was another object of love for Apollo. She feigned to return his affection and promised to marry him, provided that he would confer upon her the gift of prophecy. But having received the boon she desired, the treacherous maiden refused to comply with the conditions upon which it had been granted. Incensed at her breach of faith, Apollo, unable to recall the gift he had bestowed, rendered it useless by causing her predictions to fail in obtaining credence. Cassandra became famous in history for her prophetic powers, but her prophecies were never believed. For instance, she warned her brother Paris that if he brought back a wife from Greece, he would cause the destruction of his father's house and kingdom. She also warned the Trojans not to admit the wooden horse within the walls of the city, and foretold to Agamemnon all the disasters which afterward befell him. Apollo afterwards married Coronis, a nymph of Larissa, and thought himself happy in the possession of her faithful love. But once more he was doomed to disappointment. For one day his favorite bird, the crow, flew to him with the intelligence that his wife had transferred her affections to a youth of Haemonia. Apollo, burning with rage, instantly destroyed her with one of his death-bringing darts. Too late he repented of his rashness, for she had been tenderly loved by him, and he would fain have recalled her to life. But although he exerted all his healing powers, his efforts were in vain. He punished the crow for its garrulity in changing the color of its plumage from pure white to intense black, and forbade it to fly any longer among the other birds. Coronis left an infant son named Asclepius, who afterwards became god of medicine. His powers were so extraordinary that he could not only cure the sick, but could even restore the dead to life. At last, Hyades complained to Zeus that the number of shades conducted in his dominion was daily increasing, and the great ruler of Olympus, fearing that mankind, thus protected against sickness and death, would be able to defy the gods themselves, killed Asclepius with one of his thunderbolts. The loss of his highly gifted son so exasperated Apollo that, being unable to vent his anger on Zeus, he destroyed the Cyclops who had forged the fatal thunderbolts. For this offense, Apollo would have been banished by Zeus to Tartarus, but at the earnest intercession of Leto, he partially relented and contented himself with depriving him of all power and dignity, and imposing on him a temporary servitude in the house of Admetus, the king of Thessaly. Apollo faithfully served his royal master for 9 years in the humble capacity of shepherd, and was treated by him with every kindness and consideration. During the period of his service, the king sought the hand of Hecate, the beautiful daughter of Peleus, the son of Poseidon. But her father declared that he would only resign her to the suitor who should succeed in yoking a lion and a wild boar to his chariot. By the aid of his divine herdsman, Admetus completed this difficult task and gained his bride. Nor was this the only favor which the king received from the exiled god. For Apollo obtained from the fates the gift of immortality for his benefactor, on condition that when his last hour approached, some member of his own family should be willing to die in his stead. When the fatal hour arrived, and Admetus felt that he was at the point of death, he implored his aged parents to yield to him their few remaining days. But life is sweet, even to old age, and they both refused to make the sacrifice demanded of them. Alcestis, however, who had secretly devoted herself to death for her husband, was seized with a mortal sickness which kept pace with his rapid recovery. The devoted wife breathed her last in the arms of Admetus, and he had just consigned her to the tomb when Heracles chanced to come to the palace. Admetus held the rites of hospitality so sacred that he at first kept silent with regard to his great bereavement. But as soon as his friend heard what had occurred, he bravely descended into the tomb, and when death came to claim his prey, he exerted his marvelous strength and held him in his arms until he promised to restore the beautiful and heroic queen to the bosom of her family. While pursuing the peaceful life of a shepherd, Apollo formed a strong friendship with 2 youths named Hyacinthus and Cyparissus. But the great favor shown to them by the god did not suffice to shield them from misfortune. The former was one day throwing the discus with Apollo, when running too eagerly to take up the one thrown by the god, he was struck in the head with it and killed on the spot. Apollo was overcome with grief at the sad end of his young favorite, but being unable to restore him to life, he changed him into the flower called hyacinth. Cyparissus had the misfortune to kill by accident one of Apollo's favorite stags, which so preyed on his mind that he gradually pined away and died of a broken heart. He was transformed by the god into a cypress tree, which owes its name after this story. After those sad occurrences, Apollo quitted Thessaly and repaired to Phrygia in Asia Minor, where he met Poseidon, who, like himself, was in exile and condemned to a temporary servitude on earth. The two gods now entered the service of Laomedon, king of Troy, Apollo undertaking to tend his flocks, and Poseidon to build the walls of the city. But Apollo also contributed his assistance to the erection of those wonderful walls, and by the aid of his marvelous musical powers, the labors of his fellow worker Poseidon were rendered so light and easy that this otherwise arduous task advanced with astonishing celerity. For as the master hand of the god of music grasped the cord of his lyre, the huge blocks of stone moved of their own accord, adjusting themselves with the utmost nicety to the places designed for them. But although Apollo was so renowned in the music of art, there were two individuals who had the effrontery to consider themselves equal to him in this respect, and accordingly each challenged him to compete with them in a musical contest. These were Marsyas and Pan. Marsyas was a satyr who, having picked up the flute which Athena had thrown away in disgust, discovered to his great delight and astonishment that in consequence of its having touched the lips of a goddess, it played itself in the most charming manner. Marsyas, who was a great lover of music, and much beloved on this account by all the elf-like denizens of the woods and glens, was so intoxicated with joy at this discovery that he foolishly challenged Apollo to compete with him in a musical contest. The challenge being accepted, the Muses were chosen as umpires, and it was decided that the unsuccessful candidate should suffer the punishment of being flayed alive. For a long time, the merits of both claimants remained so equally balanced that it was impossible to award the palm of victory to either, seeing which Apollo resolved to conquer and added the sweet tones of his melodious voice to the strains of his lyre, and this at once turned the scale in his favor. The unhappy Marsyas, being defeated, had to undergo the terrible penalty, and his ultimate fate was universally lamented. Indeed, the satyrs and the dryads, his companions, wept so incessantly at his fate that their tears, uniting together, formed a river in Phrygia, which is still known by the name of Marsyas. The result of the contest with Pan is by no means so serious a character. The god of shepherds, having affirmed that he could play more skillfully on the flute of 7 reeds, the spherix or Pan's pipe, than Apollo in his world-renowned lyre, a contest ensued in which Apollo was pronounced the victor by all the judges appointed to decide between the rival candidates. Midas, the king of Phrygia, alone demurred in his decision, having the bad taste to prefer the uncouth tones of Pan's pipe to the refined melodies of Apollo's lyre. Incensed at the obstinacy and stupidity of the Phrygian king, Apollo punished him by giving him the ears of an ass. Midas, horrified at being thus disfigured, determined to hide his disgrace from his subjects by means of a cap. His barber, however, could not be kept in ignorance of the fact, and was therefore bribed with rich gifts never to reveal it. Finding, however, that he could not keep up the secret any longer, he dug a hole in the ground into which he whispered it. Then, closing up the aperture, he returned home, feeling greatly relieved at having thus eased his mind of its burden. But after all, this very humiliating secret was revealed to the world, for some reeds sprung up from the spot which murmured incessantly, as they waved to and fro in the wind, King Midas has the ears of an ass. In the sad and beautiful story of Niobe, daughter of Tantalus and wife of Amphion, king of Thebes, we have another instance of the severe punishments meted out by Apollo to those who in any way incur his displeasure. Niobe was the proud mother of 7 sons and 7 daughters, and exulting in the number of her children, she, upon one occasion, ridiculed the worship of Leto, because she had but one son and daughter, and desired the Thebans for the future to give to her the honors and sacrifices which they had hitherto offered to the mother of Apollo and Artemis. These sacrilegious words had scarcely passed her lips before Apollo called upon his sister Artemis to assist him in avenging the insult offered to their mother. And soon their invisible arrows sped through the air. Apollo slew all the sons, and Artemis had already slain all the daughters, save one, the youngest and most beloved, whom Niobe clasped in her arms, when the agonized mother implored the enraged deities to leave her at least with one of her beautiful children. But even as she prayed, the deadly arrow reached the heart of this child also. Meanwhile, the unhappy father, unable to bear the loss of his children, destroyed himself, and his dead body lay beside the lifeless corpse of his favorite son. Widowed and childless, the heartbroken mother sat among her dead, and the gods, in pity for her unutterable woe, turned her into a stone, which they transferred to Syphilis, her native Phrygian mountain, where it still continues to shed tears. The punishment of Niobe forms the subject of a magnificent marble group, which was found in Rome in the year 1553, and is now in the gallery of Uffizi in Florence. The renowned singer Orpheus was the son of Apollo and Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, and as might be expected with parents so highly gifted, was endowed with the most distinguished intellectual qualifications. He was a poet, a teacher of the religious doctrines known as the Orphic Mysteries, and a great musician, having inherited from his father an extraordinary genius for music. When he sang to the sweet tones of his lyre, he charmed all nature, and summoned round him the wild beasts of the forests, who under the influence of music became tame and gentle as lambs. The madly rushing torrents stopped their rapid course, and the very mountains and trees moved from their places at the sound of his entrancing melodies. Orpheus became united to a lovely nymph named Eurydice, the daughter of the sea god Nereus, whom he fondly loved. She was no less attracted to him, and their married life was full of joy and happiness. But it was only short-lived. For Artemis, the half-brother of Orpheus, having fallen in love with the beautiful Eurydice, forcibly endeavored to take her from her husband. And as she fled across some fields to elude his pursuit, she was bitten in the foot by a venomous snake, which lay concealed in the long grass. She died of the wound, and her sorrowing husband filled the groves and valleys with his piteous and unceasing lamentations. His longing to behold her once more became at last so unconquerable that he determined to brave the horrors of the lower world in order to entreat Hyades to restore to him his beloved wife. Armed only with his golden lyre, the gift of Apollo, he descended into the gloomy depths of Hades, where his heavenly music arrested for a while the torments of the unhappy sufferers. The stone of Sisyphus remained motionless. Tantalus forgot his perpetual thirst. The wheel of Ixion ceased to revolve, and even the Furies shed tears and withheld for a time their persecutions. Undismayed at the scenes of horror and suffering which met his view on every side, he pursued his way until he arrived at the palace of Hyades. Presenting himself before the throne on which sat the stony-hearted king and his consort Persephone, Orpheus recounted his woes to the sound of his lyre. Moved to pity by his sweet strains, they listened to his melancholy story and considered to release Eurydice on condition that he should not look upon her until they reached the upper world. Orpheus gladly promised to comply with this injunction, and followed by Eurydice, ascended the steep and gloomy path which led to the realms of life and light. All went well until he was just about to pass the extreme limits of Hades, when, forgetting for a moment the hard condition, he turned to convince himself that his beloved wife was really behind him. The glance was fatal and destroyed all his hopes of happiness, for as he yearningly stretched out his arms to embrace her, she was caught back and vanished from his sight forever. The grief of Orpheus at this second loss was even more intense than before, and he now avoided all human society. In vain did the nymphs, his once chosen companions, endeavor to win him back to his accustomed haunts. Their power to charm was gone, and music was now his sole consolation. He wandered forth alone, choosing the wildest and most secluded paths, and the hills and vales resounded with his pathetic melodies. At last he happened to cross the path of some Thracian women who were performing in the wild rites of Dionysus, and in their mad fury at his refusing to join them, they furiously attacked him and tore him in pieces. In pity for his unhappy fate, the Muses collected his remains, which they buried at the foot of Mount Olympus, and the nightingale warbled a funeral dirge over his grave. His head was thrown into the river Hebrus, and as it floated down the stream, the lips continued to murmur the beloved name of Eurydice. The chief seat of worship of Apollo was at Delphi, and here was the most magnificent of all his temples, the foundation of which reaches far beyond all historical knowledge, and which contained immense riches, the offerings of kings and private persons, who had received favorable replies from the oracle. The Greeks believed Delphi to be the central point of the earth, because two eagles sent forth by Zeus, one from the east, the other from the west, were said to have arrived there at the same moment. The Pythian Games, celebrated in honor of the victory of Apollo over the Python, took place at Delphi every 4 years. At first, celebration of these games, gods, goddesses, and heroes contended for prizes, which were gold or silver, but consisted in later times of simple laurel wreaths. On account of its being the place of his birth, the whole island of Delos was consecrated to Apollo, where he was worshipped with great solemnity. The greatest care was taken to preserve the sanctity of the spot, for which reason no one has suffered to be buried there. At the foot of Mount Cnithus was a splendid temple of Apollo, which possessed an oracle, and was enriched with magnificent offerings from all parts of Greece. Even foreign nations held this land sacred, for when the Persians passed it on their way to attack Greece, they not only sailed by, leaving it uninjured, but sent rich presents to the temple games, called Dalia, instituted by Theseus, and were celebrated by Delos every 4 years. A festival termed the Gynopedra was held at Sparta in honor of Apollo, in which boys sang the praises of the gods, and the 300 Lacedaemonians who fell at the battle of Thermopylae. Wolves and hawks were sacrificed to Apollo, and the birds sacred to him were the hawk, raven, and swan. Roman Apollo. The worship of Apollo never occupied the all-important position in Rome which it held in Greece, nor was it introduced until comparatively late period. There was no sanctuary erected in his divinity until BC 430, when the Romans, in order to avert a plague, built a temple in his honor. But we do not find the worship of Apollo becoming in any way prominent until the time of Augustus, who, having called upon this god for aid before the famous battle of Actium, ascribed the victory which he gained to his influence, and accordingly erected a temple there, which he enriched with a portion of the spoil. Augustus afterward built another temple in honor of Apollo on the Palatine Hill, in which at the foot of its statue were deposited 2 gilt chests containing the Sibylline oracles. These oracles were collected to replace the Sibylline books originally preserved in the Temple of Jupiter, which were destroyed when that edifice was burned. The Sibyls were maidens who had received the gift of prophecy and the privilege of living to an incredible age. One of these Sibyls, known as Cucumin, appeared in the Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome, offering for sale 9 books which she informed him had been written by herself. Not knowing who she was, Tarquin refused to buy them, upon which she burned 3 and returned with 6, demanding the same price as before. Being again driven away as an impostor, she again retired and burned 3 more, returning with the remaining 3, for which she still asked the same price as the first. Tarquin, amazed at her inconsistency, now consulted with the augurs, who blamed him for not having bought the 9 books when they were first offered to him, and desired him to secure the remaining 3 at whatever price they were to be had. He accordingly purchased the volumes, which were found to contain predictions of great importance to Rome. After the disposal of the books, the Sibyl vanished and was seen no more. The most beautiful and renowned of all the statues of Apollo now in existence is that known as the Apollo Belvedere, which was found in 1503 among the ruins of ancient Antium. It was purchased by Pope Julius II, who removed it to the Belvedere of the Vatican, from whence it takes its name, and where it had been for more than 300 years the admiration of the world. When Rome was taken and plundered by the French, this celebrated statue was transported to Paris and placed in a museum there, but in 1815 it was restored to its former place in the Vatican. The attitude of the figure, which is more than 7 feet high, is inimitable in its freedom, grace, and majesty. The forehead is noble and intellectual, and the whole countenance so exquisite in its beauty that one pauses spellbound to gaze on so perfect a conception. The god has a very youthful appearance and is unusual in all his representations, with the exception of a short mantle which falls from his shoulders, is unclothed. He stands against the trunk of a tree, up which a serpent is creeping, and his left arm is outstretched, as though about to punish. Hecate. Hecate would appear to have been originally a moon goddess worshipped by the Thracians. She became confounded and eventually identified with Selene and Persephone, and is one of those divinities of whom the ancients had various conflicting accounts. Hecate was the daughter of Perses and gold-wreathed Astrea, and her sway extended over earth, heaven, and hell, for which reason she is represented in works of art as a triple divinity, having 3 female bodies, all young and beautiful and united together. In later times, when this divinity becomes identified with Persephone, she is supposed to inhabit the lower world as a malignant deity, and henceforth it is the gloomy, awe-inspiring side of her character which alone develops itself. She now presides over all practices connected with witchcraft and enchantments, haunts, sepulchres, and the point where the roads cross, lonely spots where murders have been committed. She is supposed to be connected with the appearance of ghosts and specters, to possess unlimited influence over the powers of the lower world, and to be able to lay to rest unearthly apparitions by her magic spells and incantations. Hecate appears as a gigantic woman bearing a torch and sword. Her feet and hair are formed of snakes, and her passage is accompanied by voices of thunder, weird shrieks and yells, and the deep baying and howling of dogs. Her favor was propitiated by offerings and sacrifices, principally consisting of black lambs. Her festivals were celebrated at night by torchlight, when these animals were offered to her, accompanied by many peculiar ceremonies. These ceremonies were carried out with the minutest attention to detail, as it was believed that the omission of the slightest particular would afford to her ministers, the evil spirits of the lower world who hovered around the worshippers, an opportunity for entering among them and exerting their baneful influence. At the end of every month, food was placed wherever 2 roads meet, in readiness for her and other malignant divinities. In studying the peculiar characteristics which Hecate assumes when she usurps the place of Persephone, the rightful mistress of the lower world, we are reminded of the various superstitions with regard to specters, witchcraft, etc., which have, even down to our own times, exerted so powerful an influence over the minds of the ignorant, which would appear to owe to their origin a remote pagan source. Selene. Just as Helios personified the sun, so his sister Selene represented the moon, and was supposed to drive her chariot across the sky, whilst her brother was reposing after the toils of the day. When the shades of evening began to enfold the earth, the 2 milk-white steeds of Selene rose out of the mysterious depths of Oceanus, seated in a silvery chariot and accompanied by her daughter Herse. The goddess of the dew appeared behind the mild and gentle Queen of Night, with a crescent on her fair brow, a gauzy veil flowing behind, and a lighted torch in her hand. Selene greatly admired a beautiful young shepherd named Endymion, to whom Zeus had accorded the privilege of eternal youth, combined with the faculty of sleeping whenever he desired, and as long as he wished. Seeing this lovely youth fast asleep on Mount Latmus, Selene was so struck with his beauty that she came down every night from heaven to watch over and protect him. Artemis. Artemis was worshipped by the Greeks under various appellations. to each of which belonged special characteristics. Thus, she is known as the Arcadian, Ephesian, and Beronian Artemis, but also as Selene Artemis, and in order to fully comprehend the worship of this divinity, we must consider her under each aspect. Arcadian Artemis. The Arcadian Artemis, the real Artemis of the Greeks, was the daughter of Zeus and Leto, the twin sister of Apollo. She was the goddess of hunting and chastity, and having obtained from her father permission to lead a life of celibacy, she ever remained a maiden divinity. Artemis is the feminine counterpart of her brother, the glorious god of light, and like him, she deals out destruction and sudden death to men and animals, and she is also able to alleviate suffering and cure diseases. Like Apollo also, she is skilled in the use of a bow, but in a far more eminent degree, for the character of Artemis, who devoted herself to the chase with passionate ardor, this becomes an all-distinguishing feature. Armed with her bow and quiver, and attended by her train of huntresses, who were nymphs of the woods and springs, she roamed over the mountains in pursuit of her favorite exercise, destroying in her course the wild animals of the forest. When the chase was ended, Artemis and her maidens loved to assemble in a shady grove or on the banks of a favorite stream, where they joined in the merry song or graceful dance and made the hills resound with their joyous shouts. As a type of purity and chastity, Artemis was especially venerated by young maidens who before marrying sacrificed their hair to her. She was also the patroness of those who vowed celibacy and punished severely any infringement of their obligation. The huntress goddess is represented as being a head taller than her attendant nymphs, and always appears as a youthful and slender maiden. Her features are beautiful, but wanting in gentleness of expression. Her hair is gathered negligently into a knot at the back of her well-shaped head, and her figure, although somewhat masculine, is most graceful in its attitude and proportions. The short robe she wears leaves her limbs free for the exercise of the chase, her devotion to which is indicated by the quiver which is hung over her shoulder and the bow which she bears in her hand. There are many famous statues of this divinity, but the most celebrated is that known as the Diana of Versailles, now in the Louvre, which forms a not unworthy companion to the Apollo Belvedere of the Vatican. In this statue, the goddess appears in the act of rescuing a hunted deer from its pursuers, on whom she is turning with angry mien. One hand is laid protectively on the head of the stag, whilst the other she draws an arrow from the quiver which hangs over her shoulder. Her attributes are the bow, quiver, and spear. The animals sacred to her are the hind, dog, bear, and wild boar. Artemis promptly resented any disregard or neglect of her worship. A remarkable instance of this is shown in the story of the Caledonian boar hunt, which is as follows. Oeneus, king of the Caledon in Aetolia, had incurred the displeasure of Artemis by neglecting to include her in a general sacrifice to the gods, which he had offered up, out of gratitude for a bountiful harvest. The goddess, enraged at this neglect, sent a wild boar of extraordinary size and prodigious strength, which destroyed the sprouting grain, laid waste to the fields, and threatened the inhabitants with famine and death. At this juncture, Meleager, the brave son of Oeneus, returned from the Argonautic expedition, and finding his country ravaged by this dreadful scourge, entreated the assistance of all the celebrated heroes of the age to join him in hunting the ferocious monster. Among the most famous of those who responded to his call were Jason, Castor and Pollux, Idas and Lynceus, Peleus, Telamon, Admetus, Pirithous, and Theseus. The brothers of Althea, wife of Oeneus, joined the hunters, and Meleager also enlisted the service of his fleet-footed huntress, Atalanta. The father of this maiden was Shonius, an Arcadian, who was disappointed at the birth of a daughter when he particularly desired a son, and he had exposed her on the Parthenian hill where he left her to perish. Here she was nursed by a she-bear, and at last found by some hunters, who reared her and gave her the name of Atalanta. As the maiden grew up, she became an ardent lover of the chase, and was alike distinguished for her beauty and courage. Although often wooed, she led a life of strict celibacy, an oracle having predicted that inevitable misfortune awaited her should she give herself in marriage to any of her numerous suitors. Many of the heroes objected to hunt in company with the maiden, but Meleager, who loved Atalanta, overcame their opposition, and the valiant band set out on their expedition. Atalanta was the first to wound the boar with her spear, but not before two of the heroes had met their death from his fierce tusks. After a long and desperate encounter, Meleager succeeded in killing the monster and presented the head and hide to Atalanta as trophies of the victory. The uncles of Meleager, however, forcibly took the hide from the maiden, claiming it was their right to the spoil as next of kin, if Meleager resigned it. Artemis, whose anger was still unappeased, caused a violent quarrel to arise between uncles and nephew, and in the struggle which ensued, Meleager killed his mother's brothers, and then restored the hide to Atalanta. When Althea beheld the dead bodies of the slain heroes, her grief and anger knew no bounds. She swore to revenge the death of her brothers on her own son, and unfortunately for him, the instrument of vengeance lay ready at her hand. For the birth of Meleager, the Moirae, or Fates, had entered the house of Oeneus, and pointing to a piece of wood then burning on the hearth, declared that as soon as it was consumed, the babe would surely die. On hearing this, Althea seized the brand, laid it up carefully in a chest, and henceforth preserved it as her most precious possession. But now, love for her son, giving place to the resentment she felt against the murder of her brothers, she threw the fatal brand into the devouring flames. As it consumed, the vigor of Meleager wasted away, and when it was reduced to ashes, he expired. Repenting too late the terrible effects of her rash deed, Althea, in remorse and despair, took her own life. The news of the courage and intrepidity displayed by Atalanta in the famous boar hunt being carried to the ears of her father caused him to acknowledge his long-lost child. Urged by him to choose one of her numerous suitors, she consented to do so, but made it a condition that he alone, who would outstrip her in the race, should become her husband, whilst those she defeated should be put to death by her with the lance which she bore in her hand. Thus many suitors perished, for the maiden was unequaled for swiftness of foot. But at last a beautiful youth named Hippomenes, who had vainly endeavored to win her love by his assiduous attentions in the chase, ventured to enter the fatal list. Knowing that only by stratagem could he hope to be successful, he obtained, by the help of Aphrodite, 3 golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides, which he threw down at intervals during the course. Atalanta, secure of victory, stooped to pick up the tempting fruit, and in the meantime Hippomenes arrived at the goal. He became the husband of the lovely Atalanta, but forgot in his newly found happiness the gratitude which he owed to Aphrodite, and the goddess withdrew her favor from the pair. Not long after, the prediction which foretold misfortune to Atalanta in the event of her marriage was verified, for she and her husband, having strayed unsanctioned into a sacred grove of Zeus, were both transformed into lions. The trophies of the ever-memorable boar hunt had been carried by Atalanta into Arcadia, and for many centuries the identical hide and enormous tusks of the Caledonian boar hung in the temple of Athena at Tega. The tusks were afterward conveyed to Rome and shown there among other curiosities. A forcible instance of the manner in which Artemis resented any intrusion on her retirement is seen in the fate which befell her famous hunter, Actaeon, who, happening one day to see Artemis and her attendants bathing, imprudently ventured to approach the spot. The goddess, incensed at his audacity, sprinkled him with water and transformed him into a stag, whereupon he was torn in pieces and devoured by his own dogs. Ephesian Artemis. The Ephesian Artemis, known to us as Diana of the Ephesians, was a very ancient Asiatic divinity of Persian origin called Metra, whose worship the Greek colonists found already established when they first settled in Asia Minor, and whom they identified with their own Greek Artemis, although she really possessed but one single attribute in common with their home deity. Metra was a twofold divinity and represented, in one phase of her character, all-pervading love, and in the other, she was the light of heaven. And as Artemis, in her character as Selene, was the only Greek female divinity who represented celestial light, the Greek settlers, according to their custom of fusing foreign deities into their own, seized at once upon this point of resemblance, and decided that Metra should be henceforth regarded as identical with Artemis. In her character was the love which pervades all nature and permeates everywhere. They believed her also to be present in the mysterious realm of shades, where she exercised her benign sway, replacing to a certain extent that ancient divinity Hecate, and partly usurping this place of Persephone as mistress of the lower world. Thus they believed that it was she who permitted the spirits of the departed to revisit the earth in order to communicate with those they loved and to give them timely warning of upcoming evil. In fact, this great, mighty, and omnipresent power of love, as embodied in the Ephesian Artemis, was believed by the great thinkers of old to be the ruling spirit of the universe, and it was to her influence that all the mysterious and beneficent workings of nature were ascribed. There was a magnificent temple erected to this divinity at Hephæstus, a city of Asia Minor, which was ranked among the 7 wonders of the world and was unequaled in beauty and grandeur. The interior of this edifice was adorned with statues and paintings and contained 127 columns, 60 feet in height, each column having been placed there by a different king. The wealth deposited in this temple was enormous, and the goddess was here worshipped with particular awe and solemnity. In the interior of the edifice stood a statue of her, formed of ebony, with lions on her arms and turrets on her head, whilst a number of breasts indicated the fruitfulness of the earth and of nature. Setephion was the principal architect of this world-renowned structure, which, however, was not entirely completed until 220 years after the foundation stone was laid. But the labor of centuries was destroyed in a single night, for a man called Herostratus, seized with the insane desire of making his name famous to all succeeding generations, set fire to it and completely destroyed it. So great was the indignation and sorrow of the Ephesians at this calamity that they enacted a law forbidding the incendiary's name to be mentioned, thereby, however, defeating their own object. For thus the name of Herostratus has been handed down to posterity and will live as long as the memory of the famous temple of Hephæstus. Baronian Artemis. In ancient times, the country which we now call the Crimea was known by the name of the Taurica Tirosias. It was colonized by Greek settlers who, finding that the Scythian inhabitants had a native divinity somewhat resembling their own Artemis, identified her with the huntress goddess of the mother country. The worship of this Taurian Artemis was attended with the most barbarous practices, for in accordance with the law which she enacted, all strangers, whether male or female, landing or shipwrecked on her shores, were sacrificed upon her altars. It is supposed that this decree was issued by the Taurian goddess of chastity to protect the purity of her followers by keeping them apart from foreign influences. The interesting story of Iphigenia, a priestess in the temple of Artemis at Taurus, forms the subject for one of Schiller's most beautiful plays. The circumstances occurred at the commencement of the Trojan War and are as follows. The fleet, collected by the Greeks for the siege of Troy, had assembled at Aulis in Boeotia and was about to set sail, when Agamemnon, the commander-in-chief, had the misfortune to kill accidentally a stag which was grazing in a grove sacred to Artemis. The offended goddess sent continuous calms that delayed the departure of the fleet, and Calchas, the soothsayer, who had accompanied the expedition, declared that nothing less than the sacrifice of Agamemnon's favorite daughter, Iphigenia, would appease the wrath of the goddess. At these words, the heroic heart of the brave leader sank within him, and he declared that rather than consent to so fearful an alternative, he would give up his share in the expedition and return to Argos. In this dilemma, Odysseus and other great generals called a council to discuss the matter, and after much deliberation, it was decided that private feeling must yield to the welfare of the state. For a long time, the unhappy Agamemnon turned a deaf ear to their arguments, but at last they succeeded in persuading him that it was his duty to make the sacrifice. He accordingly dispatched a messenger to his wife, Clytemnestra, begging her to send Iphigenia to him, alleging as a pretext that the great hero Achilles desired to make her his wife. Rejoicing at the brilliant destiny which awaited their beautiful daughter, the fond mother at once obeyed the command and sent her to Aulis. When the maiden arrived at her destination and discovered to her horror the dreadful fate which awaited her, she threw herself in an agony of grief at her father's feet, and with sobs and tears entreated him to have mercy on her and spare her young life. But alas, her doom was sealed, and now her repentant and heartbroken father was powerless to avert it. The unfortunate victim was bound to the altar, and already the fatal knife was raised to deal a death blow, when suddenly Iphigenia disappeared from view, and in her place on the altar lay a beautiful deer ready to be sacrificed. It was Artemis herself, who, pitying the youth and beauty of her victim, caused her to be conveyed in a cloud to Taurica, where she became one of her priestesses and entrusted with the charge of her temple, a dignity, however, which necessitated the offering of those human sacrifices presented to Artemis. Many years passed, during which time the long and wearisome siege of Troy had come to an end, and the brave Agamemnon had returned home to meet death at the hands of his wife Hephæstus. But his daughter, Iphigenia, was still in exile from her native country and continued to perform the terrible duties which her office involved. She had long given up hope of ever being restored to her friends, when one day 2 Greek strangers landed on Taurica's inhospitable shores. They were Orestes and Pylades, whose romantic attachment to each other had made their names synonymous for devoted, self-sacrificing friendship. Orestes was Iphigenia's brother, and Pylades her cousin, and their object in undertaking an expedition fraught with so much peril was to obtain the statue of the Taurian Artemis. Orestes, having incurred the anger of the Furies for avenging the murder of his father Agamemnon, was pursued by them wherever he went, until at last he was informed by the oracle of Delphi that in order to pacify them, he must convey the image of the Taurian Artemis from Taurus to Attica. This he at once resolved to do, and accompanied by his faithful friend, who insisted on sharing the dangers of the undertaking, he set out for Taurica. But the unfortunate youths had hardly stepped on shore before they were seized by the natives, who as usual conveyed them for sacrifice to the temple of Artemis. Iphigenia, discovering that they were Greeks, although unaware of their relationship to herself, thought the opportunity a favorable one for sending tidings of her existence to her native country, and accordingly she requested one of the strangers to be the bearer of a letter from her to her family. A magnanimous dispute now arose between the friends, and each besought the other to accept the precious privilege of life and freedom. Pylades, at length overcome by the urgent entreaties of Orestes, agreed to be the bearer of the missive, but on looking more closely at the superscription, he observed to his intense surprise that it was addressed to Orestes. Hereupon an explanation followed. The brother and sister recognized each other amid joyful tears and loving embraces, and assisted by her friends and kinsmen, Iphigenia escaped with them from a country where she had spent so many unhappy days and witnessed so many scenes of horror and anguish. The fugitives, having contrived to obtain the image of Taurian Artemis, carried it with them to Berens in Attica. This divinity was henceforth known as the Berenian Artemis, and the rites which rendered her worship so infamous in Taurica were now introduced into Greece, and human victims bled freely under the sacrificial knife in both Athens and Sparta. The revolting practice of offering human sacrifices to her was continued until the time of Lycurgus, the great Spartan lawgiver, who put an end to it by substituting in its place one which was hardly less barbarous, namely the scourging of youths who were whipped on the altars of the Berenian Artemis in the most cruel manner. Sometimes indeed they expired under the lash, in which case their mothers, far from lamenting their fate, are said to have rejoiced, considering this an honorable death for their sons. Selene Artemis. Hitherto we have seen Artemis only in the various phases of her terrestrial character. But just as her brother Apollo drew into himself by degrees the attributes of that more ancient divinity Helios, the sun god, so in a manner she became identified in later times with Selene, the moon goddess, in which character she is always represented as wearing on her forehead a glittering crescent, whilst a flowing veil, bespangled with stars, reaches to her feet, and a long robe completely envelops her. Diana. The Diana of the Romans was identified with the Greek Artemis, with whom she shares that particular tripartite character which so strongly marks the individuality of the Greek goddess. In heaven she was Luna, the moon; on earth Diana, the huntress goddess; and in the lower world Proserpine. But unlike the Ephesian Artemis, Diana, in her character as Proserpine, carries with her into the lower world no element of love or sympathy. She is, on the contrary, characterized by practices altogether hostile to man, such as the exercise of witchcraft, evil charms, and other antagonistic influences, and is in fact the Greek Hecate in her later development. The statues of Diana are generally erected at a point where three roads meet, for which reason she is called Trivia, from tri, three, and via, way. A temple was dedicated to her on the Aventine Hill by Severius Tullius, who is said to have first introduced the worship of this divinity into Rome. The Nemoralia, or Grove Festivals, are celebrated in her honor on the 13th of August on the Lacus Nemoranos, or forest-buried lake, near Aricia. The priest who officiated her temple in this spot was always a fugitive slave who had gained his office by murdering his predecessor, and hence was constantly armed in order that he might thus be prepared to encounter a new aspirant. Hephæstus. Hephæstus, the son of Zeus and Hera, was the god of fire in its beneficial aspect, and the presiding deity over all workmanship accompanied by means of this useful element. He was universally honored, not only as the god of all mechanical arts, but also as a house and hearth divinity who exercised a beneficial influence on civilized society in general. Unlike the other Greek divinities, he was ugly and deformed, being awkward in his movements and limping in his gait. This latter defect originated, as we have already seen, in the wrath of his father Zeus, who hurled him down from heaven in consequence of his taking part of Hera in one of the domestic disagreements, which so frequently arose between that royal pair. Hephæstus was a whole day falling from Olympus to the earth, where he at length alighted on the island of Lemnos. The inhabitants of the country, seeing him descending through the air, received him in their arms, but in spite of their care, his leg was broken by the fall, and he remained ever afterward lame in one foot. Grateful for the kindness of the Lemnians, he henceforth took up his abode on their island, and therefore built himself a superb palace, the forges for the pursuit of his avocation. He instructed the people how to work in metals, and also taught them other valuable and useful arts. It is said that the first work of Hephæstus was a most ingenious throne of gold, with secret springs which he presented to Hera. It was arranged in such a manner that once seated, she found herself unable to move, and though all the gods endeavored to extricate her, their efforts were unavailing. Hephæstus thus revenged himself on his mother for the cruelty she had always displayed toward him, on account of his want and comeliness and grace. Dionysus, the wine god, contrived, however, to intoxicate Hephæstus, and then induced him to return to Olympus, where, after having released the Queen of Heaven from her very undignified position, he became reconciled to his parents. He now built for himself a glorious palace on Olympus of shining gold, and made for the other deities those magnificent edifices which they inhabited. He was assisted in his various and exquisitely skillful works of art by 2 female statues of pure gold formed by his own hand, which possessed the power of motion, and always accompanied him wherever he went. With the assistance of the Cyclops, he forged for Zeus his wonderful thunderbolts, thus investing his mighty father with a new power of terrible import. Zeus testified his appreciation of this precious gift by bestowing upon Hephæstus the beautiful Aphrodite in marriage. But this was a questionable boon, for the lovely Aphrodite, who was the personification of all grace and beauty, felt no affection for her ungainly and unattractive spouse, and amused herself by ridiculing his awkward movements and unsightly person. On one occasion especially, when Hephæstus good-naturedly took upon himself the office of cupbearer to the gods, his hobbling gait and extreme awkwardness created the greatest mirth among the Celestials, in which his disloyal partner was the first to join with unconcealed merriment. Aphrodite greatly preferred Ares to her husband, and this preference naturally gave rise to much jealousy on the part of Hephæstus and caused them great unhappiness. Hephæstus appears to have been an indispensable member of the Olympic assembly, where he plays the part of smith, armorer, chariot builder, etc. As already mentioned, he constructed the palaces where the gods resided, fashioned the golden shoes which they trod their air or water, and built for them their wonderful chariots. They shod with brass horses of celestial breed, which conveyed these glittering equipages over land and sea. He also made the tripods, which moved of themselves in and out of the celestial halls, formed for Zeus the far-famed Aegis, and erected the magnificent palace of the sun. He also created the brazen-footed bulls of Hades, which breathed flames from their nostrils and sent forth clouds of smoke, filling the air with their roaring. Among his most renowned works of art for the use of mortals were the armor of Achilles and Aeneas, the beautiful necklace of Harmonia, and the crown of Ariadne. But his masterpiece was Pandora, of whom a detailed account has already been given. There was a temple on Mount Etna erected in his honor, which none but the pure and virtuous were permitted to enter. The entrance to this temple was guarded by dogs, which possessed the extraordinary faculty of being able to discriminate between the righteous and the unrighteous, fawning upon and caressing the good, while they rushed upon all evildoers and drove them away. Hephæstus is usually represented as a powerful, brawny, and very muscular man of middle height and mature age. His strong, uplifted arm is raised in the act of striking the anvil with a hammer, which he holds in one hand, whilst in the other he is turning a thunderbolt, which an eagle beside him is waiting to carry to Zeus. The principal seat of his worship was the island of Lemnos, where he was regarded with peculiar veneration. Vulcan. The Roman Vulcan was merely an incorporation from Greece, which never at any time took firm root in Rome, nor entered largely into the actual life and sympathies of the nation, his worship being unattended by the devotional feeling and enthusiasm which characterized the religious rites of other deities. He still, however, retained in Rome his Greek attributes as god of fire and unrivaled master of the art of working with metals. He was ranked among the 12 gods of the Olympians, whose gilded statues were arranged consecutively along the forum. His Roman name, Vulcan, would seem to indicate a connection with the first great metalworking artificer of biblical history, Tubal-Cain. Poseidon. Poseidon was the king of Kronos and Rhea and the brother of Zeus. He was the god of sea, more particularly of the Mediterranean, and like the element over which he presided, was of a variable disposition, now violently agitated and now calm and placid, for which reason he is sometimes represented by the poets as quiet and composed, and others as disturbed and angry. In the earliest ages of Greek mythology, he merely symbolized the watery element, but in later times, as navigation and intercourse with other nations engendered greater traffic by sea, Poseidon gained an importance and came to be regarded as a distinct divinity, holding indisputable dominion over the sea and over all the sea divinities who acknowledged him as their sovereign ruler. He possessed the power of causing at will mighty and destructive tempests, in which the billows rise mountains high, the wind becomes a hurricane, land and sea being enveloped in thick mists, whilst destruction assails the unfortunate mariners exposed to their fury. On the other hand, his alone was the power of stilling the angry waves, of soothing the troubled waters, and granting safe voyagers to mariners. For this reason, Poseidon has always been invoked and propitiated by a libation before a voyage was undertaken, and sacrifices and thanksgivings were gratefully offered to him after a safe and prosperous journey by sea. The symbol of his power was the fisherman's fork or trident, by means of which he produced earthquakes, raised up islands from the bottom of the sea, and caused wells to spring forth out of the earth. Poseidon was essentially the presiding deity over fishermen, and was on that account more particularly worshipped and revered in countries bordering on the seacoast, where fish naturally formed a staple commodity of trade. He was supposed to vent his displeasure by sending disastrous inundations, which completely destroyed whole countries, and were usually accompanied by terrible marine monsters, who swallowed up and devoured those whom the floods had spared. It is probable that these sea monsters are the poetical figures which represent the demons of hunger and famine, necessarily accompanying a general inundation. Poseidon is generally represented as resembling his brother Zeus in features, height, and general aspect, but we miss in the countenance of the sea god the kindness and benignity which so pleasingly distinguish his mighty brother. The eyes are bright and piercing, and the contour of his face somewhat sharper in its outline than that of Zeus, thus corresponding, as it were, with his more angry and violent nature. His hair waves in dark, disorderly masses over his shoulders. His chest is broad, and his frame powerful and stalwart. He wears short, curling beard and a band around his head. He usually appears standing erect in a graceful shelled chariot, drawn by hippocampes or seahorses, with golden manes and brazen hoofs, who bound over the dancing waves with such wonderful swiftness that the chariot scarcely touches the water. The monsters of the deep, acknowledging their mighty lord, gambol playfully around him, whilst the sea joyfully smooths a path for the passage of its all-powerful ruler. He inhabited a beautiful palace at the bottom of the sea, at Aegea and Euboea, but also possessed a royal residence on Mount Olympus, which, however, he only visited when his presence was required at the council of the gods. His wonderful palace beneath the waters was of vast extent, and its lofty and capacious halls thousands of his followers could assemble. The exterior of the building was a bright gold, with a continual wash of waters preserved untarnished, and in the interior lofty and graceful columns supported a gleaming dome. Everywhere fountains of glistening silvery water played. Everywhere groves and arbors of feathery-leaved sea plants appeared, whilst rocks of pure crystal glistened with all the varied colors of the rainbow. Some of the paths were strewn with sparkling white sand, interspersed with jewels, pearls, and amber. This delightful abode was surrounded on all sides by wide fields, where there were whole groves of dark purple coralline and tufts of beautiful scarlet-leaved plants, and sea anemones of every tint. Here grew bright pink seaweeds, mosses of all hues and shades, and tall grasses, which growing upward formed emerald caves and grottos such as the Nereides love, whilst fish and various kinds playfully darted in and out, in the full enjoyment of their native element. Nor was illumination wanting in this fairy-like region, which at night was lit up by glowworms of the deep. But although Poseidon ruled with absolute power over the ocean and its inhabitants, he nevertheless bowed submissively to the will of the great ruler of Olympus, and appeared at all times desirous of conciliating him. We find him coming to his aid when emergency demanded, and frequently rendering him valuable assistance against his opponents. At the time when Zeus was harassed by the attacks of the giants, he proved himself a most powerful ally, engaging in single combat with hideous giant named Polybos, who he followed over the sea and at last succeeded in destroying by hurling him upon the island of Cos. These amicable relations between the brothers were, however, sometimes interrupted. Thus, for instance, upon one occasion, Poseidon joined Hera and Athena in a secret conspiracy to seize upon the ruler of heaven, place him in fetters, and deprive him of sovereign power. The conspiracy being thus discovered, Hera was the chief instigator of this sacrilegious attempt on the divine person of Zeus, was severely chastised and even beaten by her enraged spouse as a punishment for her rebellion and treachery. Poseidon was condemned for the space of a whole year to forego his dominion over the sea, and it was at that time, in conjunction with Apollo, he built for Laomedon the walls of Troy. Poseidon married a sea nymph named Amphitrite, whom he wooed under the form of a dolphin. She afterwards became jealous of a beautiful maiden called Scylla, who was beloved by Poseidon, and in order to revenge herself, she threw some herbs into a well where Scylla was bathing, which had the effect of metamorphosing her into a monster of terrible aspect, having 12 feet, 6 heads with 6 long necks, and a voice which resembled the bark of a dog. This awful monster is said to have inhabited a cave at the very great height of the famous rock which still bears her name, and was supposed to swoop down from her rocky eminence upon every ship that passed, and with each of her 6 heads secure a victim. Amphitrite is often represented assisting Poseidon in attaching the seahorses to his chariot. The Cyclops, who have already alluded to in the history of Cronus, were the sons of Poseidon and Amphitrite. They were a wild race of gigantic growth, similar in their nature to the earth-born giants, and had only one eye in the middle of their foreheads. They led a lawless life, possessing neither social manners nor fear of the gods, and were the workmen of Hephæstus, whose workshop was supposed to be in the heart of the volcanic mountain Etna. Here we have another striking instance of the manner in which the Greeks personified the powers of nature, which they saw in active operation around them. They beheld with awe, mingled with astonishment, the fire, stones, and ashes which poured from earth, from the summit of this and other volcanic mountains, and with their vivacity of imagination found a solution to the mystery in the supposition that the fire god must be busy at work with his men in the depths of the earth, and that the mighty flames which they beheld issued in this manner from his subterranean forge. The chief representation of the Cyclops was the man-eating monster Polyphemus, described by Homer as having been blinded and outwitted by Odysseus. This monster fell in love with a beautiful nymph called Galatea, but as may be supposed, his addresses were not acceptable to the fair maiden, who rejected them in favor of a young youth named Acis, upon which Polyphemus, with his usual barbarity, destroyed the life of his rival by throwing him upon a gigantic rock. The blood of the murdered Acis, gushing out of the rock, formed a stream which still bears his name. Triton, Rhoda, and Benthesime were the children of Poseidon and Amphitrite. The sea god was the father of two giant sons called Otus and Ephialtes. When only 9 years old, they were said to be 27 cubits in height and 9 in breadth. These youthful giants were as rebellious as they were powerful, even presuming to threaten the gods themselves with hostilities. During the war of the Gigantomachia, they endeavored to scale heaven by piling mighty mountains one upon the other. Already they had succeeded in placing Mount Ossa on Olympus and Pelion on Ossa, when this impious project was frustrated by Apollo, who destroyed them with his arrows. It was supposed that had not their lives been thus cut off before reaching maturity, their sacrilegious designs would have been carried into effect. Peleus and Neleus were also sons of Poseidon. Their mother Tyro was attached to the river god Enopeus, whose form Poseidon assumed and thus won her love. Peleus became afterwards famous in the story of the Argonauts, and Neleus was the father of Nestor, who was distinguished in the Trojan War. The Greeks believed that it was Poseidon that they were indebted to the existence of the horse, which he is said to have produced in the following manner. Athena and Poseidon both claiming the right to name Cecropia, the ancient name of Athens. A violent dispute arose, which was finally settled by an assembly of the Olympian gods, who decided that whichever of the contending parties presented mankind with the most unusual gift should obtain the privilege of naming the city. Upon this, Poseidon struck from the ground with his trident, and the horse sprang forth with all of its untamed strength and graceful beauty. From the spot which Athena touched with her wand issued the olive tree, whereupon the gods unanimously awarded to her the victory, declaring her gift to be the emblem of peace and plenty, while that of Poseidon was thought to be the symbol of war and bloodshed. Athena accordingly called the city Athens after herself, and it has ever since retained this name. Poseidon tamed the horse for the use of mankind, and was believed to have taught men the art of managing horses by the bridle. The Isthmian Games, so named because they were held on Isthmus of Corinth, in which horse and chariot races were the distinguishing feature, were instituted in honor of Poseidon. He was more specially worshipped in the Peloponnesus, although universally revered throughout Greece and in the south of Italy. His sacrifices were generally black and white bulls, also wild boars and rams. His usual attributes are the trident, horse, and dolphin. In some parts of Greece, this divinity was identified with the sea god Nereus, for which reason the Nereides, or daughters of Nereus, are represented as accompanying him. Neptune. The Romans worshipped Poseidon under the name Neptune and invested him with all the attributes which belonged to the Greek divinity. The Roman commanders never undertook any naval expedition without propitiating Neptune with a sacrifice. His temple at Rome was in the Campus Martius, and the festivals commemorated in his honor were called Neptunalia. Thank you for joining us at Nightfall Sleep Radio. We hope you've enjoyed this section of our journey with E.M. Berens. Please subscribe to hear the next episode and to explore the full series. The playlist is linked in the description. Until next time, rest easy and have a good night.